Welcome to tonight. We're diving into a chilling Agatha Christie-style mystery set in the shadowy halls of a 1920s English country estate. Grab a cup of tea, settle in, and let's unravel the secrets of Ravenshade Parlor. Oh, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Chapter 1. The Gathering Store. The wind howled across the moors, its mournful cry rattling the leaded windows of Ravenshade Hall, a sprawling Georgian estate nestled deep in the English countryside. It was October 1927, and the air carried the sharp, crisp bite of autumn, tinged with the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke. The estate, though grand in its proportions, bore the weight of faded opulence. Ivy clung tenaciously to its weathered stone walls, curling like fingers over the chipped cornices, and the once manicured gardens sprawled in wild disarray, whispering tales of neglect. The tall chimneys stood sentinel against the bruised sky, and the distant bleat of sheep on the moors only deepened the sense of isolation. Miss Jane Marple, a slight figure in a tweed coat and sensible hat, arrived by a rattling taxi that struggled up the winding drive. Her knitting bag, ever present, was tucked under her arm, a comforting constant in an unfamiliar setting. She had been invited by her old friend, Lady Beatrice Langley, a vivacious widow known for her charm and her penchant for hosting eclectic gatherings. Miss Marple, whose sharp eyes missed little, stepped out onto the gravel path, noting the uneven stones and the faint air of disrepair that hung about the place. "Much like St. Mary Mead," she murmured to herself, "where grandeur often hides a multitude of secrets." Lady Beatrice greeted her at the heavy oak doors, her silver hair swept elegantly beneath a velvet shawl. "Jane, my dear," she exclaimed, her voice warm but tinged with a nervous energy. "You've come at just the right time. Ravenshade needs a bit of your quiet wisdom." Her smile was bright, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in her friend's eyes, a detail she filed away as they entered the cavernous hall. The interior of Ravenshade was a study in contrasts. Polished mahogany paneling gleamed under flickering gaslights, but the air held a chill that the roaring fire in the great hearth couldn't dispel. Portraits of stern-faced Langleys lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow the guests as they moved. Beatrice had assembled a curious group for the weekend, ostensibly to celebrate the estate's centenary, though Miss Marple suspected other motives lay beneath the surface. As they gathered in the parlor for tea, she observed the company with her usual unobtrusive scrutiny, her fingers already busy with her knitting needles. First was Charles Langley, Beatrice's nephew, a handsome man in his 30s with a disarming smile and a careless air. His tailored suit was impeccable, but Miss Marple noted the frayed cuffs and the slight flush of his cheeks, suggesting a life of excess. He lounged in an armchair, sipping brandy and regaling the room with tales of his latest ventures in London, though his eyes darted nervously to his aunt. Evelyn Warwick, a striking actress with auburn hair and a sharp tongue, held court by the window, her laughter ringing out like a bell. Her career, once illustrious, had been marred by scandal, and her presence at Ravenshade seemed to stir unease. She deflected Charles's flirtations with a practiced ease, but Miss Marple caught the fleeting venom in her glance toward Beatrice. Dr. Morris Hartley, a reserved physician with wire-rimmed spectacles, sat apart, engrossed in a book on toxicology. His quiet demeanor belied a keen intellect, and Miss Marple noted his long fingers stained faintly yellow as if from handling chemicals. When he spoke, it was with precision, his words measured but carrying an undercurrent of fascination with rare poisons. Margaret Crane, the estate's governess and bookkeeper, was a dour woman in her 40s, her severe bun and plain dress marking her as one who valued order above all. She clutched a ledger, her pen scratching furiously as she muttered about expenses. Her eyes, however, betrayed a restless intensity, as if guarding secrets beyond mere numbers. Victor Henshaw, a brusque businessman with a ruddy complexion, paced the room, his heavy steps echoing on the parquet floor. He spoke loudly of his intent to purchase Ravenshade, his eyes gleaming with ambition. Beatrice's polite deflections only seemed to fuel his determination, and Miss Marple wondered what drove his urgency. Finally, there was Clara Langley, Beatrice's young ward, a pale girl of 20 with delicate features and a nervous habit of twisting her locket. She hovered at the edge of the group, her eyes darting between the guests as if expecting some unseen threat. When Beatrice rested a hand on her shoulder, Clara flinched, a reaction Miss Marple noted with interest. Tea was served by Mr. Gibbs, the butler, a stooped man with a lined face and a manner so deferential it bordered on reverence. His hands trembled slightly as he poured, and Miss Marple's keen gaze caught the way he lingered near Beatrice, as if reluctant to leave her side. The parlor was warm, the fire crackling, but the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tensions. Charles's laughter rang too loud, Evelyn's wit cut too sharply, and Victor's pacing grew more agitated as the afternoon wore on. Beatrice, ever the gracious hostess, announced a celebratory dinner that evening to mark Ravenshade's centenary. "We'll open a bottle of the 1895 Chateau Margaux from the cellar," she said, her eyes sparkling. "A rare treat for a rare occasion." The guests murmured their approval, but Miss Marple noticed Clara's sudden pallor and Margaret's tightened grip on her ledger. Dr. Hartley's book snapped shut, and Victor paused mid-stride, his expression unreadable. As the group dispersed to dress for dinner, Miss Marple lingered in the parlor, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. She wandered to the tall windows, peering out at the darkening moors. The estate felt alive with secrets, each guest a thread in a tangled skein. Charles's debts, rumored to be substantial, might make him desperate. Evelyn's past, whispered about in London's drawing rooms, could be a motive for revenge. Dr. Hartley's knowledge of poisons was too convenient to ignore, and Margaret's ledgers might hide more than financial irregularities. Victor's ambition seemed to border on obsession, and Clara's nervousness suggested a hidden burden. Even Gibbs, with his quiet devotion, struck her as a man who saw more than he let on. She recalled a similar gathering in St. Mary Mead, where a seemingly innocent tea party had unraveled into betrayal. "People are much the same everywhere," she mused, her needles pausing. "They wear their masks, but the truth always slips through." The dinner hour approached, and the guests reconvened in the dining room, a grand space lit by a chandelier that cast flickering shadows. The table was set with silver and crystal, the Chateau Margaux decanted into a gleaming vessel. Beatrice, resplendent in emerald silk, raised her glass in a toast. "To Ravenshade," she said, "and to secrets shared among friends." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Miss Marple, seated at the far end, watched as the wine was poured. Charles's hand shook slightly as he raised his glass. Evelyn's smile was brittle, her eyes fixed on Beatrice. Dr. Hartley sniffed his wine with clinical interest, while Margaret's gaze remained on her plate. Victor toasted loudly, his voice jarring, and Clara barely touched her glass, her fingers trembling. Gibbs moved silently, refilling glasses, his face impassive. The meal progressed, the conversation stilted but polite. Beatrice spoke of Ravenshade's history, of ancestors who built its legacy, and of her plans to preserve it. Miss Marple listened, her mind cataloging every glance, every pause. Something was amiss, though she couldn't yet name it. The air felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Then, as the dessert course was served, a piercing scream shattered the silence. Clara stood, her chair toppling, her face ashen. All eyes turned to Beatrice, who sat motionless, her glass of wine spilled across the damask cloth, a dark stain spreading like blood. Her face was pale, her lips tinged blue, and her eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. Miss Marple's knitting fell to her lap. her heart steady despite the chaos. "Dear me," she said softly. "It seems we have a puzzle to solve." Chapter 2. The Crime Discovered. The scream that shattered the dining room's tense silence came from Clara Langley, who stood trembling, her delicate hands clutching the edge of the table. Her wide eyes were fixed on Lady Beatrice Langley, slumped in her high-backed chair at the head of the table. The crystal wine glass Beatrice had raised moments ago lay toppled, its contents, a deep crimson pool of the 1895 Chateau Margaux, spreading across the pristine damask tablecloth like a wound. The chandelier's flickering light cast eerie shadows, and the air, heavy with the scent of roasted pheasant and beeswax, now carried a faint, acrid tang that Miss Jane Marple, seated quietly at the table's far end, noted with a slight tilt of her head. Chaos erupted. Charles Langley leapt to his feet, his chair scraping harshly against the parquet floor. "Aunt Beatrice!" he cried, his voice cracking as he rushed to her side. His hands hovered over her, uncertain, as if afraid to touch the lifeless figure. Evelyn Warwick, the actress, clutched her pearls, her face a mask of theatrical horror, though her eyes darted sharply around the room. Dr. Maurice Hartley, the reserved physician, was the first to act with purpose. He pushed past Charles, his spectacles glinting as he knelt beside Beatrice, pressing 2 fingers to her wrist, his brow furrowed, and after a moment he rose, his voice low but authoritative. "She's dead," he declared. "Poison, I'd wager. The cyanosis, blue lips, rapid onset, points to something like cyanide." The word poison hung in the air, sharp and accusing. Margaret Crane, the dour governess, stood abruptly, her ledger falling to the floor with a thud. "Poison?" she repeated, her voice shrill. "That's impossible. We were all here." Victor Henshaw, the businessman, stopped his restless pacing, his ruddy face paling as he stared at the spilled wine. "This is madness," he muttered, his eyes narrowing at Charles. "You're the heir, Langley. What's your game?" Charles whirled on him, fists clenched. "How dare you? I loved her!" Evelyn's laugh, sharp and brittle, cut through the tension. "Oh, please, Charles. Your debts are no secret. Did she refuse you one too many times?" Clara, still trembling, sank into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably. "She was so kind," she whispered, her words barely audible. "Who would do this?" Mr. Gibbs, the butler, stood frozen by the sideboard, his hands clasped tightly, his face a mask of shock. Miss Marple, her knitting untouched since the scream, observed the scene with her characteristic calm, her sharp eyes cataloging every reaction. The dining room, with its heavy oak doors and tall leaded windows, was sealed tight. Beatrice's habit, she'd explained, to protect her prized wines from curious hands. No one had entered or left since the meal began at 7 o'clock. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the decanter, its crystal facets catching the candlelight. The wine poured by Gibbs from that very vessel had been shared among the guests, yet only Beatrice lay dead. "Curious," she murmured, her voice soft but clear in the sudden hush that followed the accusations. "A locked room, a single death, and a table full of secrets." The local constable, a young man named Perkins, arrived within the hour, his round face flushed from the cold night air. He was clearly out of his depth, his notebook trembling in his hands as he surveyed the scene. "Right then," he stammered. "Nobody leaves this room until we sort this out." He bolted the doors, preserving the crime scene, Beatrice's untouched plate of pheasant, the spilled wine, the decanter, and the scattered dessert dishes. Dr. Hartley, at Perkins's request, sniffed the glass cautiously, confirming the faint almond-like odor of cyanide. "It's unmistakable," he said, his academic tone betraying a hint of fascination. "Fast-acting, deadly in small doses." Miss Marple leaned forward, her spectacles glinting. "Dr. Hartley, was the decanter tampered with before dinner?" she asked gently, her tone that of a kindly aunt seeking clarification. Hartley hesitated, then shook his head. Gibbs filled it this afternoon. I saw him carry it from the cellar myself. Gibbs nodded vigorously, his voice hoarse. I swear, ma'am, it was untouched. Sealed bottle, opened in the kitchen, poured straight into the decanter. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythmic clicking, a sound that seemed to steady the room. And yet, she said almost to herself, here we are. Perkins, overwhelmed, announced he would send for Scotland Yard, but recognizing Miss Marple's reputation from a previous case in St. Mary Mead, allowed her to assist. You've a knack for this sort of thing, miss, he said, half in awe. Miss Marple smiled modestly, her eyes never leaving the suspects. The initial questioning began, and motives surfaced like shadows in the candlelight. Charles, pale and defensive, admitted his gambling debts had strained his relationship with Beatrice. She was going to help me, he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. Evelyn, her composure cracking, revealed a recent quarrel with Beatrice over a scandal involving a shared lover years ago. She threatened to drag it all up again, Evelyn snapped, her eyes flashing. But I didn't need to kill her for it. Dr. Hartley's medical bag left in the hall contained vials that raised Perkins's eyebrows, though Hartley dismissed them as research samples. I study poisons, not use them, he said coolly. Margaret's ledger, retrieved from the floor, showed discrepancies in the estate's accounts, small sums siphoned off over months. When pressed, she stammered, "It's nothing, just errors." Victor, his voice booming, admitted his desperation to buy Ravenshade to settle a business debt. But murder? He scoffed. I'd rather negotiate than kill. Clara, still sobbing, confessed that Beatrice had planned to change her will, potentially cutting her out as ward. She said I wasn't ready, Clara whispered, twisting her locket. Miss Marple listened, her mind weaving connections. Charles's debts suggested desperation, but his affection for Beatrice seemed genuine. Evelyn's past gave her motive, yet her flair for drama made her an unlikely poisoner. Hartley's knowledge of cyanide was suspicious, but his calm demeanor suggested confidence, not guilt. Margaret's financial irregularities hinted at embezzlement. But would she kill to hide it? Victor's ambition was clear, but poison seemed an odd choice for a man of blunt action. Clara's fearfulness could mask deeper secrets, and Gibbs's quiet devotion to Beatrice felt almost too perfect. The dining room itself drew Miss Marple's attention. The heavy doors, bolted from the inside, showed no signs of tampering. The windows, though old, were locked, their latches rusted in place. The table held no obvious clues beyond the spilled wine and Beatrice's glass, now carefully bagged by Perkins. Yet something nagged at Miss Marple, a detail out of place. She rose, her movements slow and deliberate, and approached the fireplace where a small grate sat flush against the stone. Kneeling carefully, she peered inside, noting a faint scattering of ash that seemed fresher than the fire's embers. Interesting, she said softly, her fingers brushing the grate's edge. Perkins, watching her, scratched his head. What's that, miss? Miss Marple straightened, her expression serene. Just a thought, Constable. In my village, we once had a case where a fireplace held more than warmth. Perkins blinked, unsure, but noted her words in his book. As the questioning continued, the suspects' alibis held firm. All were seated when Beatrice drank the fatal wine at 7:15 p.m. Gibbs had poured from the decanter at 7 dawn when no one had approached Beatrice's glass afterward. Yet the poison was undeniable, its effects swift and merciless. Miss Marple's mind turned to the mechanics of the crime. A locked room, she mused, is only as secure as the hands within it. The night grew late, and Perkins dismissed the guests to their rooms, posting a constable at the door. Miss Marple lingered, her knitting bag in hand, her eyes sweeping the room one last time. The decanter gleamed mockingly, its contents untouched by the other guests. The almond-like scent, Clara's trembling hands, Gibbs's unwavering loyalty. All were pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. In St. Mary Mead, she said to herself, we learned that the simplest acts hide the darkest truths. As she left the dining room, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows like a warning. The mystery of Ravenshade Hall had only begun to unfold. Chapter 3. The investigation begins by morning. The storm that had battered Ravenshade Hall had subsided, leaving a damp chill that seeped through the estate's creaking floorboards and echoed its past grandeur. The dining room, now a crime scene, was bathed in pale sunlight filtering through the leaded windows, illuminating the damask tablecloth stained with spilled wine. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, stood near the fireplace, her sharp eyes scanning the room where Lady Beatrice Langley had met her end the previous night. The heavy oak doors remained bolted, the windows locked tight, and the crystal decanter, now in police custody, had tested positive for cyanide, though the poison's source remained elusive. Inspector Crane from Scotland Yard arrived shortly after dawn, his gruff demeanor and neatly trimmed mustache marking him as a man of order. He carried a leather notebook, his pen moving briskly as he surveyed the scene. "A nasty business, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat. "Constable Perkins speaks highly of you. Says you've a knack for puzzles like this." Miss Marple smiled modestly, her needles clicking softly. "I only observe, Inspector," she replied. "People are much the same, whether in St. Mary Mead or here at Ravenshade." Crane's initial inspection confirmed the dining room's isolation. The bolted doors showed no signs of tampering, and the windows, though old, were secure, their latches rusted in place. The decanter, filled by the butler, Mr. Gibbs, the previous afternoon had been handled only by him before the fatal pour. Beatrice's glass, with its faint almond-like odor, was the sole vessel tainted, yet all guests had drunk from the same decanter without ill effect. "A locked room," Crane muttered, rubbing his chin. "Damned peculiar." Miss Marple, her attention drawn to the fireplace, knelt to examine the small grate she'd noted the night before. The ash within was fresher than the fire's embers, and a faint draught stirred where none should have been. "Inspector," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "might we have this grate inspected? It seems out of place." Crane raised an eyebrow but nodded, instructing Perkins to fetch a tool to pry it open. The grate revealed nothing but a narrow flue too small for entry, yet Miss Marple's curiosity lingered. "In my village," she said, "a chimney once hid a secret that changed everything." Crane began interviewing the suspects, each confined to their rooms under Perkins's watch. Miss Marple, granted leave to assist, joined him, her unassuming presence disarming the guests. Charles Langley, Beatrice's nephew, was first, his handsome face haggard from a sleepless night. He admitted his gambling debts had grown dire, over $5,000, a sum Beatrice had refused to cover. "She said I needed to learn my lesson," he said, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "But I'd never harm her. She was my only family." His voice broke, but Miss Marple noted his trembling hands, much like those of a young man in St. Mary Mead who'd lied about a theft. Evelyn Warwick, the actress, sat poised in her room, her auburn hair catching the morning light. She admitted to a bitter quarrel with Beatrice over a scandal from her past, a love affair that had cost Evelyn a lucrative role. "Beatrice threatened to tell the papers," she said, her lips curling. "She called it protecting the family name. But poison? That's not my style." Her defiance was convincing, yet Miss Marple caught the flicker of fear in her eyes, reminiscent of a village girl caught in a lie. Dr. Morris Hartley, the physician, was calm, his spectacles glinting as he answered Crane's questions. His medical bag, inspected by Perkins, contained vials of various compounds, including a small amount of cyanide for academic study. I lecture on toxicology, he said coolly. It's purely professional. When pressed about his interest in rare poisons, he grew defensive, his fingers tapping the arm of his chair. Miss Marple, watching closely, recalled a village doctor whose calm exterior hid a dangerous obsession. Margaret Crane, the governess, clutched her ledger as if it were a shield. The discrepancies in the estate's accounts, small sums diverted over months, came to light under Crane's scrutiny. They were errors, she insisted, her voice tight. I was correcting them. But her eyes darted to the door, and Miss Marple noted the similarity to a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper who'd skimmed profits for years. Errors, she murmured, can sometimes be deliberate. Victor Henshaw, the businessman, was belligerent, his ruddy face flushed with indignation. He admitted his bid to buy Ravenshade was tied to a looming business debt. Beatrice was stalling, he growled. Said the estate wasn't for sale, but I didn't need to kill her. I'd have outbid anyone. His bluster reminded Miss Marple of a village merchant whose loud protests masked guilt. Clara Langley, Beatrice's ward, was a trembling wreck, her locket twisted tightly in her fingers. She confessed that Beatrice had planned to revise her will, potentially cutting Clara out. She said I was too young to handle the responsibility, Clara whispered, tears welling. But I loved her like a mother. Her fragility seemed genuine, yet Miss Marple noted the locket's clasp, worn as if frequently opened, suggesting a secret kept close. Mr. Gibbs, the butler, was questioned in the servants' quarters, his lined face pale but composed. He reiterated that he'd filled the decanter from a sealed bottle in the cellar under Beatrice's strict instructions. I've served her 30 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'd never harm her. His trembling hands, however, caught Miss Marple's eye, much like those of a loyal servant in St. Mary Mead who'd acted out of misplaced devotion. As the interviews concluded, Crane shared his findings. All suspects were in the dining room when Beatrice drank at 7:15 p.m., and no one had approached her glass after Gibbs poured. The cyanide's presence in the glass, but not the decanter, baffled him. It's impossible, he said, pacing. No one could have tampered with it under our noses. Miss Marple, her knitting needles moving steadily, offered a gentle smile. Impossible crimes, Inspector, are often the simplest when you see the right thread. She requested to speak with the staff, starting with the housemaid, Lily, who'd assisted Gibbs in the kitchen. Lily, a nervous girl of 18, confirmed the decanter was filled at 4:00 p.m. and placed in the dining room by 6:00. Mr. Gibbs was particular, she said. He locked the cellar himself. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the timing. The wine was poured at 7, Beatrice drank at 7:15, and death followed swiftly. The locked room remained the puzzle's heart. Returning to the dining room, Miss Marple studied the table. The spilled wine had dried, leaving a dark stain. Beatrice's plate, untouched, suggested she'd felt ill before the poison took hold. The other guests' glasses, tested by Crane's men, showed no trace of cyanide. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the fireplace grate, where the draught and fresh ash nagged at her. She recalled a case in her village where a hidden compartment had turned a locked room mystery on its head. Inspector, she said, might we check the cellar? The wine's journey began there. Crane agreed, and they descended to the cellar, a damp, stone-walled space lined with dusty bottles. Gibbs unlocked the door, his hands steadier now, and showed them the shelf where the Chateau Margaux had been stored. The bottle, now empty, bore no signs of tampering, but Miss Marple noted a faint scratch on the decanter's base, barely visible in the dim light. A small thing, she said, but small things often matter. Back in the dining room, Crane confided his frustration. Every suspect has a motive, but no one had the chance. It's like the poison appeared by magic. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. Magic, Inspector, is only a trick we haven't understood. In St. Mary Mead, I learned that the quietest people often hold the loudest secrets. As the morning wore on, the suspects remained under watch, their alibis unshaken but their tensions palpable. Miss Marple sat by the parlor window, her knitting a steady rhythm, her mind weaving connections. The locked room, the decanter, the grate, the motives, all were threads in a tapestry not yet complete. "We're only beginning," she murmured, her needles pausing. "The truth lies in what we've overlooked." Chapter 4. Clues and Red Herrings. The second day at Ravenshade Hall dawned gray and heavy, the moors outside shrouded in mist that clung to the estate's weathered stones. Inside, the air was thick with suspicion, the guests confined to their rooms under Constable Perkins's watchful eye. Miss Jane Marple sat in the parlor, her knitting needles clicking steadily, her mind sifting through the fragments of the puzzle that was Lady Beatrice Langley's murder. The locked dining room, the cyanide-tainted glass, and the untouched decanter were pieces that refused to fit. Yet Miss Marple knew from her St. Mary Mead days that the truth often hid in plain sight. Inspector Crane, his notebook brimming with notes, joined her in the parlor, his gruff demeanor softened by a grudging respect. "You were right about the cellar, Miss Marple," he said, rubbing his mustache. "That scratch on the decanter's base, it's odd, but it doesn't explain how the poison got into her glass." Miss Marple nodded, her spectacles glinting. "Small things, Inspector, often lead to larger truths. Let us see what else this house reveals." Their first lead came from a search of the suspects' rooms conducted with Perkins's assistance. In Dr. Maurice Hartley's medical bag, tucked among bandages and syringes, Crane found a small vial labeled potassium cyanide, its contents intact but damning. Hartley, summoned to explain, was indignant. "It's for my research," he insisted, his voice steady but his fingers tapping nervously. "I lecture on toxicology at King's College. That vial's never been opened." Crane's eyes narrowed, but Miss Marple noted the vial's pristine seal. Too perfect, perhaps, for a man accused of murder. "In St. Mary Mead," she said softly, "we once found a stolen necklace in a vicar's drawer, placed there to mislead. In Evelyn Warwick's room, a torn letter was discovered beneath a pile of scripts. The fragments, pieced together, read, 'You owe me, and I'll collect BL.' Evelyn, her auburn hair disheveled, dismissed it with a wave. 'Beatrice was always dramatic,' she said. 'It's probably about some old debt from our theater days. Nothing worth killing over.' Her nonchalance was practiced, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in her eyes like a village actress who'd rehearsed her lines too well. Charles Langley's room yielded a bookmaker's ledger confirming debts of $6,200, more than he'd admitted. When confronted, he slumped in his chair, his charm fading. "I begged Aunt Beatrice for help," he said. "She refused, said I'd squandered enough, but I'd never hurt her." His voice cracked, yet Miss Marple noted his clenched fists, reminiscent of a young man in her village who'd lied to protect his pride. Margaret Crane's ledger, already under scrutiny, revealed payments to an unknown R.C. Small sums, but consistent, totaling over $500. Margaret, her face pale, stammered, "It's a clerical error. I meant to correct it." Crane pressed her, but she clammed up, her eyes darting to the door. Miss Marple, watching closely, recalled a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper whose errors hid a deeper scheme. Victor Henshaw's briefcase contained a contract for Ravenshade's purchase, dated a week before Beatrice's death, suggesting insider knowledge. Victor, his ruddy face flushed, scoffed. "It's a draft," he said. "I was optimistic, that's all. Beatrice was stalling, but I didn't need her dead to seal the deal." His bluster was convincing, yet Miss Marple wondered if his ambition ran deeper than he let on. Clara Langley's locket, which she clutched even now, held a photograph, not of her rumored fiancé, but of an older man, perhaps in his 50s, with a stern face. When asked, Clara's eyes filled with tears. "It's private," she whispered. "Beatrice didn't approve, but it's not what you think." Her secrecy intrigued Miss Marple, who recalled a village girl whose hidden letters had unraveled a mystery. A red herring surfaced when Lily, the housemaid, reported seeing a stranger near the cellar the day before the murder. "He was lurking by the gate," she said, twisting her apron. Crane dispatched Perkins to investigate, but the stranger was quickly identified as a delivery boy from the village, dropping off supplies. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A distraction," she said to Crane. "In my village, we once chased a phantom thief only to find the real culprit at home." The dining room remained the heart of the puzzle. Miss Marple returned to it, her eyes drawn to the fireplace grate where she'd noted the fresh ash. With Crane's permission, she had Perkins remove the grate, revealing a narrow flue dusted with fine particles that didn't match the fire's embers. "Not wood ash," she murmured, collecting a sample in a handkerchief. Crane sent it for analysis, though he was skeptical. "It's too small for anyone to crawl through," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "But small spaces can hide big secrets, Inspector." Another clue emerged from Clara's behavior. Her perfume, which Miss Marple had noticed the previous night, carried a faint almond-like scent, eerily similar to cyanide's odor. When questioned, Clara blushed. "It's just my fragrance, rose and almond oil. I've worn it for years." She produced a small bottle, its scent matching her claim. Crane dismissed it, but Miss Marple filed the detail away, recalling a village case where a scent had misled an entire investigation. The decanter's scratch, noted in the cellar, nagged at Miss Marple. She examined it again, now stored in a locked cabinet under Perkins's guard. The mark was faint, almost deliberate, as if meant to be found. "A clever touch," she said softly, "but perhaps too clever." She recalled a St. Mary Mead burglary where a scratched lock had been a deliberate misdirection. Crane's team scoured the estate for further clues. A groundskeeper reported seeing Gibbs near the cellar late the previous afternoon, though Gibbs claimed he was merely checking the wine. A kitchen maid mentioned Margaret lingering in the dining room before dinner, adjusting the table settings, though she swore it was routine. These tidbits, while suggestive, led nowhere concrete, and Crane's frustration grew. "Every clue points to everyone and no one," he grumbled. Miss Marple, undeterred, revisited the timeline. Gibbs filled the decanter at 4 p.m., placed it in the dining room by 6 and poured the wine at 7. Beatrice drank at 7:15, collapsing moments later. The other guests' glasses, tested clean, ruled out a contaminated decanter. The poison, then, was in Beatrice's glass alone. But how? The locked room offered no answers, its bolted doors and rusted windows mocking the investigation. A new lead emerged when Perkins found a small key in the dining room, tucked beneath a rug near the sideboard. It didn't match any known lock in the house, yet its presence was odd. Miss Marple turned it over in her hands, her mind racing. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "a key once unlocked a secret drawer that changed everything." Crane ordered a search for hidden compartments, but none were found, and the key remained a mystery. As the day wore on, the suspect's tensions simmered. Charles avoided Evelyn, who taunted him about his debts. Margaret snapped at Clara for crying, while Victor argued with Hartley over the estate's value. Gibbs moved silently, his devotion to Beatrice evident in his red-rimmed eyes. Miss Marple watched them all, her knitting a steady rhythm, her thoughts weaving a pattern. The vial, the letter, the ledger, the contract, the locket, the ash, the perfume, the key, each was a thread, but the tapestry was incomplete. Crane, pacing the parlor, turned to her. "What do you make of it, Miss Marple? We've got motives galore, but no one had the chance." She looked up, her eyes twinkling. "Chance, Inspector, is often a matter of perspective. In my village, we learned that the most obvious clues are sometimes the least true. The mist outside thickened, cloaking Ravenshade in secrecy. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind fixed on the grate, the scratch, and the almond scent. "We're missing something," she murmured. "Something small but vital." Chapter 5. Complications and Twists. The third day at Ravenshade Hall brought a restless energy, as if the estate itself were holding its breath. The mist outside had lifted, but the air inside remained heavy with suspicion. The suspect's nerves fraying under the weight of Inspector Crane's relentless questioning. Miss Jane Marple sat in the parlor, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The locked room mystery of Lady Beatrice Langley's poisoning, cyanide in her wine glass yet absent from the shared decanter, had deepened, with clues like the fireplace ash, the scratched decanter, and the mysterious key leading to more questions than answers. A significant twist emerged that morning when Beatrice's solicitor, Mr. Harrow, arrived from London, his briefcase stuffed with papers. In a private meeting with Crane and Miss Marple, he revealed that Beatrice had drafted a new will just days before her death, set to disinherit her nephew, Charles Langley, and name her ward, Clara Langley, as the primary heir to Ravenshade. The document, found torn in half in the library's desk, was unsigned, rendering it invalid. "She planned to sign it this week," Harrow said, his voice dry. "She mentioned concerns about Charles's recklessness." Crane's eyes narrowed. "So Clara stood to gain everything?" Harrow nodded, adding, "Beatrice also hinted at a family secret, something she intended to reveal soon." This revelation sent ripples through the investigation. Charles, when confronted, was furious, his charm replaced by a scowl. "She was cutting me out," he spat, pacing his room. "I begged her for help, but murder, never." His anger seemed genuine, but Miss Marple noted his clenched fists, reminiscent of a St. Mary Mead youth whose pride had led to ruin. Clara, trembling as always, clutched her locket when told of the will. "I didn't know," she whispered. "She never told me." Her tears flowed, but Miss Marple wondered if her fragility masked calculation. Another complication arose when Crane's team re-examined Dr. Maurice Hartley's cyanide vial, found in his medical bag. A closer inspection revealed it was empty, its seal broken but cleverly resealed to appear untouched. "Someone planted it," Hartley insisted, his calm cracking for the first time. "I'd never be so careless." Crane suspected a frame-up, but by whom? Miss Marple, recalling a village case where evidence was staged, murmured, "The guilty often point fingers to hide their own." The investigation took a darker turn with Evelyn Warwick's torn letter, which had hinted at a debt to Beatrice. A deeper search of her room uncovered a second note, hidden in a hat box, written in Beatrice's hand. "Pay me by month's end or London hears all, BL." Crane pressed Evelyn, who admitted Beatrice was blackmailing her over a past affair that had nearly ruined her career. "She wanted $1,000, Evelyn said, her voice bitter. "I told her I'd pay, but I didn't kill her." Her defiance was fierce, yet Miss Marple caught the tremor in her hands, like a village actress caught in a scandal. Victor Henshaw's contract for Ravenshade, found in his briefcase, proved to be a forgery, its date and signature expertly faked. Victor, outraged, claimed no knowledge of the fraud. "Someone's trying to ruin me," he bellowed. Crane suspected it was meant to implicate him, but the contract's origin remained unclear. Miss Marple, turning the document over, noted the precise handwriting, unlike Victor's bold scrawl. "A careful hand," she said, "like one I knew in St. Mary Mead, who forged a will to stir trouble." Clara's locket offered another twist. When Crane gently pressed her to open it, the photograph inside was revealed to be of an older man, not her rumored fiancé, but someone she called Uncle James, a distant Langley relative. Clara admitted Beatrice had forbidden her to contact him, citing a family scandal. He was her brother, but they quarreled years ago, Clara said, her voice barely audible. She said he was a disgrace. The revelation hinted at the family secret Harrow mentioned, but Clara clammed up, her locket snapping shut. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on her, recalling a village girl whose secrets had unraveled a theft. The butler, Mr. Gibbs, became a focal point when Lily, the housemaid, nervously reported seeing him linger near the dining room sideboard before dinner, adjusting the glasses. Gibbs, when questioned, admitted checking the table settings but swore he touched nothing. A search of his quarters revealed a photograph of Beatrice in her youth, inscribed with the words, "To my faithful friend, forever yours, B." His devotion, bordering on obsession, struck Miss Marple as significant. "Loyalty," she murmured to Crane, "can be a dangerous thing when it turns to despair." The fireplace grate, with its curious ash, yielded a new clue when the sample Miss Marple collected was analyzed. It contained traces of cyanide residue, suggesting the poison had been hidden there, perhaps in a small container, before being used. The flue, though narrow, could have concealed a vial retrievable during the chaos after Beatrice's death. Crane was skeptical. "No one could reach it without being seen," he said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "In St. Mary Mead, we once found a stolen ring in a chimney placed there by a clever hand." The mysterious key found under the dining room rug remained a puzzle. Crane's team searched for hidden compartments, but no lock matched it. Miss Marple, turning it over, noted its intricate design, unlike the estate's standard keys. "It may belong to something personal," she said, "like a diary or a box." Crane ordered a search of Beatrice's study, where they found a locked diary, but the key didn't fit. The diary itself, when pried open, contained cryptic entries about betrayals and R.C., the same initials in Margaret's ledger. Margaret, confronted, insisted it was a coincidence, but her pallor suggested otherwise. Another twist came from the groundskeeper, who reported seeing Clara near the cellar the day before the murder, carrying a small bottle. Clara, tearful, admitted it was her almond-scented perfume, which she'd spilled and replaced. "I was embarrassed," she said. "Beatrice hated clumsiness." The explanation held, but Miss Marple noted the timing. Too convenient, perhaps, like a village girl's alibi that unraveled under scrutiny. The timeline tightened. Gibbs filled the decanter at 4:00 p.m., placed it in the dining room by 6 Mon, and poured at 7 Son. Beatrice drank at 7:15, collapsing moments later. The cyanide confined to her glass suggested a precise method, but the locked room, doors bolted, windows rusted shut, defied logic. Miss Marple revisited the dining room, her eyes lingering on the sideboard where Gibbs had stood. A faint mark on the wood, barely noticeable, suggested something had been moved. "A small thing," she said to Crane, "but the smallest things often break the case." Crane's frustration mounted. "We've got motives, clues, and now this will business, but no clear path," he said, pacing. Miss Marple's needles paused, her voice gentle. "In St. Mary Mead, Inspector, we learned that complications often hide the simplest truth. The poison was in the glass, not the decanter. We must ask how and why." The suspects, gathered briefly for lunch under Perkins's watch, were a study in tension. Charles avoided Clara, who seemed shaken by the will's revelation. Evelyn snapped at Victor, who argued with Hartley over trivialities. Margaret scribbled in her ledger, her hands trembling, while Gibbs served in silence, his eyes fixed on Beatrice's empty chair. Miss Marple watched, her mind weaving connections: the torn will, the empty vial, the forged contract, the locket's photo, the cyanide ash, the cryptic diary. Each was a thread, but the pattern was elusive. As evening fell, the estate seemed to close in, its shadows lengthening. Miss Marple sat by the parlor window, her knitting steady, her thoughts racing. "We're close," she murmured, "but the truth is still hidden, like a needle in a haystack." The key, the grate, the glass, all pointed to a clever mind, one that knew Ravenshade's secrets intimately. Chapter 6. The Revelation. The fourth day at Ravenshade Hall dawned with a brittle clarity. The moors outside bathed in pale sunlight that did little to warm the tense atmosphere within. The grand estate, with its ivy-clad walls and creaking floors, seemed to hold its secrets tighter, as if guarding the truth behind Lady Beatrice Langley's murder. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the parlor with her knitting bag at her side, had spent the night turning over the clues. The cyanide in Beatrice's glass, the locked dining room, the fireplace grate's ash, the scratched decanter, the mysterious key, the torn will, and the web of motives weaving through the suspects. Her needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm against the storm of her thoughts. Inspector Crane, his notebook worn from constant use, joined her, his gruff demeanor softened by exhaustion. "We've got a mess of clues, Miss Marple," he said, rubbing his eyes. "The will, the vial, the diary. Everyone's got a motive, but the locked room stumps me." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "In St. Mary Mead, Inspector, the most complex puzzles often have the simplest solutions. Shall we gather the guests? I believe the pieces are falling into place." At Miss Marple's request, Crane assembled the suspects in the parlor, the same room where they'd taken tea 4 days ago, now heavy with suspicion. Charles Langley sat slumped, his charm dulled by worry. Evelyn Warwick, her auburn hair pinned tightly, maintained a defiant poise. Dr. Morris Hartley adjusted his spectacles, his calm barely masking unease. Margaret Crane clutched her ledger, her lips pursed. Victor Henshaw paced, his ruddy face flushed with impatience. Clara Langley, pale and trembling, twisted her locket. Mr. Gibbs, the butler, stood by the door, his lined face impassive but his hands clasped tightly. Miss Marple rose, her small figure commanding the room with quiet authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice warm yet deliberate, "we are here to uncover the truth behind Lady Beatrice's death. A locked room, a poisoned glass, and a house full of secrets. This is a puzzle, but one we can solve." The suspects shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between her and Crane. She began with the crime's mechanics. "The cyanide was in Beatrice's glass, not the decanter," she said. "Tests confirmed the other glasses were clean, yet all were poured from the same vessel at 7 p.m. Beatrice drank at 7:15 and collapsed moments later. The poison then was introduced to her glass alone. But how? She paused, letting the question hang. The answer lies in a method both simple and ingenious. A dissolvable film coated with cyanide placed inside the glass before the wine was poured. The film, invisible to the eye, dissolved in the wine, releasing the poison only when Beatrice drank. Crane nodded, impressed. Clever, but how was it placed there? The room was locked and Gibbs poured the wine in front of us all. Miss Marple's smile was gentle. "The room was locked, Inspector, but the poison was not delivered during dinner. It was prepared earlier by someone who knew the house intimately." She turned to the fireplace grate where the cyanide residue had been found. "This grate," she said, "held a small vial of cyanide hidden in the flue. The ash we found was residue from its handling, not from the fire. The killer retrieved it during the chaos after Beatrice's collapse when all eyes were on her." The suspects murmured, their faces a mix of shock and suspicion. Miss Marple addressed the clues that had misled them. "The scratch on the decanter," she said, "was a deliberate distraction meant to suggest tampering where none occurred. The vial in Dr. Hartley's bag was planted, its empty contents a clever frame-up. The torn letter in Miss Warwick's room hinted at blackmail, but it was Beatrice's own scheme, not a motive for murder." The forged contract in Mr. Henshaw's briefcase was meant to implicate him, but its careful handwriting pointed elsewhere. Miss Crane's ledger and its RC payments were troubling, but a financial motive doesn't fit the crime's precision. And Miss Clara's locket with its photograph of Uncle James suggested a family secret, but it was not the heart of this matter. She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. Each clue pointed to a suspect, yet none explained the locked room. In St. Mary Mead, I learned that the truth often lies with the person who knows the house best, someone whose loyalty masks a deeper purpose. The room grew still as Miss Marple turned to Mr. Gibbs, the butler. "Mr. Gibbs," she said gently, "you have served Ravenshade for 30 years. Your devotion to Lady Beatrice was evident in every action, every glance. But it was more than duty, wasn't it?" Gibbs's face paled, his hands trembling. The others stared, their murmurs silenced. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. "Beatrice planned to sell Ravenshade to Mr. Henshaw, a decision you could not bear. This estate was your life, your purpose. The photograph in your quarters, inscribed, 'To my faithful friend, forever yours,' spoke of a bond deeper than service. When Beatrice announced her intent to sell, it broke something in you. You could not let Ravenshade pass to another." She explained the method. "You knew the dining room secrets, including the flue behind the grate, where you hid the cyanide vial. Before dinner, you coated Beatrice's glass with a dissolvable film, prepared with cyanide from your access to the cellar's chemicals. Used for cleaning silver, perhaps, but deadly in skilled hands. You poured the wine at 7 hours, knowing the film would dissolve only when Beatrice drank. During the chaos of her collapse, you retrieved the vial, leaving only traces of ash." Gibbs's composure cracked, his voice a whisper. "She was going to let it all go," he said, tears welling. "Ravenshade was her legacy, my life's work. I begged her to reconsider, but she laughed, said it was just a house. I couldn't let it end." His confession spilled out raw and broken. "I didn't want to hurt her, only to stop her. The cyanide was quick, merciful. I thought it was right." The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Charles buried his face in his hands. Evelyn's defiance softened, her eyes wide. Hartley adjusted his spectacles, stunned. Margaret's ledger fell to her lap and Victor stopped pacing, his bluster gone. Clara sobbed, clutching her locket. Crane stepped forward, his voice firm but not unkind. "Mr. Gibbs, you're under arrest for the murder of Lady Beatrice Langley." Perkins handcuffed the butler, who offered no resistance, his head bowed. As Gibbs was led away, Miss Marple watched, her expression one of quiet sorrow. "In St. Mary Mead," she said softly, "we saw how love twisted by desperation can lead to tragedy." Crane turned to her, his notebook closed. "How did you know, Miss Marple? The clues pointed everywhere." She smiled faintly. "It was the grate, Inspector. Only someone who knew every corner of this house could use it so cleverly. And Gibbs's devotion, too perfect, too intense, reminded me of a village man who acted out of love, not hate." The remaining clues fell into place. Clara's almond-scented perfume, mistaken for cyanide's odor, was a coincidence exploited by Gibbs to shift suspicion. The mysterious key, Miss Marple suggested, might belong to a private box of Beatrice's, perhaps containing letters that fueled Gibbs's fears. The torn will, the forged contract, the planted vial, all were distractions, but none matched the precision of the locked room's solution. As the suspects dispersed, shaken but relieved, Miss Marple gathered her knitting. "The human heart," she said to Crane, "is the greatest puzzle of all. It hides its truths behind loyalty, ambition, and fear." Crane nodded, his respect for her deepening. "You've a gift, Miss Marple. Scotland Yard could use you." She chuckled, her needles resuming their rhythm. I'm content in St. Mary Mead, Inspector, but mysteries, it seems, find me wherever I go. Chapter 7. Justice served the 5th day at Ravenshade Hall dawned with a quiet solemnity, the moors outside cloaked in a soft fog that seemed to mirror the lingering unease within the estate. The grand Georgian manor, with its ivy-clad walls and creaking floors, felt emptier without Lady Beatrice Langley's vibrant presence and the revelation of her murderer, Mr. Gibbs, the devoted butler, had left the household reeling. Miss Jane Marple sat in the parlor, her knitting complete, a neatly folded scarf resting in her lap. Her sharp eyes, softened by a touch of sorrow, surveyed the room where the suspects had gathered one last time, their faces etched with a mix of relief and disbelief. Inspector Crane stood by the fireplace, his gruff demeanor tempered by a quiet respect for Miss Marple's brilliance. The dining room, where Beatrice had died from a cyanide-laced glass of wine, was no longer sealed, but its heavy oak doors and rusted windows seemed to hold the memory of the locked room mystery. Gibbs's confession the previous day had unraveled the puzzle. A dissolvable cyanide film in Beatrice's glass hidden in the fireplace grate's flue, and a motive born of desperate loyalty to Ravenshade. Yet, as Miss Marple knew from her St. Mary Mead days, the truth alone did not end a story. Justice had its own rhythm. Crane addressed the group, his notebook tucked away, his voice steady. "Mr. Gibbs has been charged with the murder of Lady Beatrice Langley," he announced. His confession, corroborated by the cyanide residue in the grate and the mechanics of the poison's delivery, leaves no doubt. The suspects, seated in a semicircle, reacted in their own ways. Charles Langley, Beatrice's nephew, stared at the floor, his usual charm replaced by a hollow expression. Evelyn Warwick, the actress, sat with her arms crossed, her defiance softened by shock. Dr. Maurice Hartley adjusted his spectacles, his academic curiosity replaced by unease. Margaret Crane clutched her ledger, her stern face softened by relief. Victor Henshaw, the businessman, had stopped pacing, his ambition dimmed. Clara Langley, the young ward, twisted her locket, tears streaking her pale cheeks. Miss Marple, her voice warm but deliberate, spoke next. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "we learned that justice is not only about punishment but understanding. Mr. Gibbs's act was one of misguided devotion, a tragedy born of a heart that loved too fiercely." She turned to Crane. "Inspector, might I share a few thoughts?" He nodded, gesturing for her to continue, his respect evident. She began with the suspects, addressing the red herrings that had clouded the investigation. "Each of you," she said, "carried a burden that seemed to point to guilt. Mr. Langley, your debts, over $6,200, suggested desperation, but your affection for your aunt was genuine, much like a young man in my village who erred but loved his family." Charles looked up, his eyes glistening. "I failed her," he whispered. "But I'll make it right. No more gambling." Miss Marple nodded, her smile kind. "A promise kept is a step toward redemption." To Evelyn, she said, "Miss Warwick, Beatrice's blackmail over your past affair was cruel, but your strength in facing it showed no murderous intent. In St. Mary Mead, we had a woman whose secrets were used against her. Yet she rose above." Evelyn's lips trembled, but she managed a nod. "I'm leaving for London," she said. "A fresh start." "Dr. Hartley," she continued, "your knowledge of poisons and that planted vial in your bag made you a suspect, but your integrity held firm, like a doctor I knew who was falsely accused." Hartley exhaled, his shoulders relaxing. "I'll stick to lectures," he said wryly, earning a small smile from Crane. Margaret's ledger, with its payments to R.C., had hinted at embezzlement, but Miss Marple saw otherwise. "Miss Crane, your errors were just that, errors born of stress, not malice. In my village, a shopkeeper's mistakes were forgiven when her heart was true." Margaret's stern facade cracked and she nodded, her voice soft. I'll make amends to Clara. Victor's forged contract, meant to implicate him, was a distraction, Miss Marple explained. Mr. Henshaw, your ambition was clear, but poison was not your way. A merchant in St. Mary Mead once chased a dream too fiercely, yet found his path. Victor grunted, his ruddy face softening. Ravenshade's not worth this, he said. I'm done with it. Clara, clutching her locket, was the last. Miss Langley, Miss Marple said gently, your secret, Uncle James, the family disgrace, was a weight Beatrice placed on you. But your heart is kind, like a girl in my village who carried a burden not her own. Clara's tears fell, but she straightened. I want to honor Beatrice, she said. I'll keep Ravenshade alive for her. Miss Marple turned to the broader picture, addressing the mechanics of Gibbs's crime. The cyanide film so cleverly hidden in the glass was a method only someone with intimate knowledge of Ravenshade could devise. Mr. Gibbs, knowing the flu's secret, used it to hide the poison, retrieving it in the chaos of Beatrice's collapse. The scratched decanter, the almond-scented perfume, the planted vial, all were misdirections, but the grate told the truth. Crane nodded, marveling. You saw what we missed, Miss Marple. That flue was the key. The mysterious key found under the rug, Miss Marple suggested, likely belonged to a private box of Beatrice's, perhaps containing letters that fueled Gibbs's fears of losing Ravenshade. A final search of Beatrice's study uncovered a small locked box. Its contents, letters from Gibbs professing his devotion, confirming his motive. He loved her, Miss Marple said softly, but love, when twisted, can destroy. Gibbs, now in custody, had been taken to the village jail, his confession a heavy weight. Crane shared that he'd spoken little since, his silence that of a man broken by his own actions. He said he wanted to save Ravenshade, Crane told Miss Marple privately. Thought it was his duty. She sighed, her needle still. In St. Mary Mead we saw how duty could blind a man to right and wrong. The suspects, cleared of guilt, began to disperse. Charles vowed to settle his debts through honest work, inspired by Beatrice's memory. Evelyn packed for London, her career her focus. Hartley resumed his research, vowing to secure his chemicals better. Margaret and Clara, reconciled, planned to manage Ravenshade together, honoring Beatrice's legacy. Victor abandoned his bid, his business ambitions redirected. The estate, though scarred, felt lighter, as if the truth had lifted a shadow. Miss Marple prepared to leave, her scarf a gift for Clara, who accepted it with a shy smile. You've given us peace, Miss Marple, Clara said. How can I thank you? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Mind the company you keep, my dear, and perhaps visit St. Mary Mead someday. Clara laughed, a sound of hope in the somber hall. As the taxi waited, Crane escorted Miss Marple to the door. You've a rare gift, he said. Scotland Yard could use you. She chuckled, adjusting her hat. I'm content with my village inspector, but mysteries, it seems, follow me. The taxi rolled down the drive, the moors stretching endlessly before her, and Miss Marple smiled, ready for whatever puzzle awaited next. Ravenshade Hall receded into the mist, its secrets laid bare. The poison in the parlor had been uncovered, justice served not just through Gibbs's arrest, but through the healing of those left behind. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple knew, life went on after tragedy, and so it would here. Chapter 8. Echoes of Ravenshade. The 6th day at Ravenshade Hall broke with a tentative calm, as if the moors themselves exhaled after the storm of Lady Beatrice Langley's murder. The grand Georgian estate, its ivy-clad walls softened by morning light, stood as a silent witness to the tragedy that had unfolded within its dining room, a locked room where a cyanide-laced glass of wine had claimed Beatrice's life. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag packed and her scarf gifted to young Clara Langley, prepared to depart, but not before one final walk through the halls that had revealed so much about human nature. Her sharp eyes, framed by spectacles, missed nothing, and her heart, seasoned by the ways of St. Mary Mead, felt the weight of the case's resolution. Inspector Crane, his gruff demeanor now warmed by admiration, met her in the parlor where the fire crackled softly, chasing away the autumn chill. "You've done us a service, Miss Marple," he said, his mustache twitching with a rare smile. "Gibbs is in custody, and Scotland Yard's singing your praises." Miss Marple's needles, now stilled, rested in her lap. "I only observe, Inspector," she replied, her voice warm but tinged with melancholy. "In St. Mary Mead, we learn that every tragedy leaves ripples, and it's those ripples we must tend to." The suspects, no longer under suspicion, had gathered one last time in the parlor, their faces a map of emotions, relief, guilt, and the quiet resolve to move forward. Charles Langley, Beatrice's nephew, stood by the window, his once careless charm replaced by a somber determination. Evelyn Warwick, the actress, sat with her auburn hair loosely pinned, her defiance softened into introspection. Dr. Maurice Hartley, his spectacles polished, seemed eager to leave the estate's shadows behind. Margaret Crane, the governess, held her ledger loosely, her sternness giving way to a newfound gentleness. Victor Henshaw, the businessman, had abandoned his pacing, his ambition redirected. Clara Langley, Beatrice's ward, clutched the scarf Miss Marple had given her, her eyes bright with a fragile hope. Miss Marple addressed them, her voice deliberate yet kind, as if speaking to old friends in her village. "Ravenshade has seen a great sorrow," she began, "but it is not the end. Each of you has faced your own shadows, and now you have a chance to step into the light." Her words, simple but profound, stirred the room, and the suspects listened, their tensions easing. Charles was the first to speak, his voice low but steady. "I've been a fool," he admitted, his hands no longer trembling. "Aunt Beatrice tried to teach me, but I didn't listen. Her death, it's changed me. I'm selling my London flat to pay my debts, and I'll work properly this time." Miss Marple nodded, recalling a St. Mary Mead youth who'd turned from ruin to redemption. "A hard lesson, Mr. Langley," she said, "but one worth learning." Evelyn, her eyes softer than before, spoke next. "Beatrice's blackmail was a wound I carried too long," she said. "I'm done hiding. London's waiting, and I'll rebuild my name honestly." Her resolve reminded Miss Marple of a village actress who'd faced scandal and emerged stronger. "A courage, Miss Warwick," she said, "is the best stage of all." Dr. Hartley, his academic coolness tempered, adjusted his spectacles. "That vial in my bag shook me," he admitted. "I've been careless, too focused on theory. I'm locking my research away, sticking to teaching." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Knowledge, Dr. Hartley, is safest when shared wisely, like a doctor in my village who learned to heal hearts as well as bodies." Margaret, her ledger open but untouched, looked at Clara. "I was harsh," she said, her voice cracking. "Beatrice trusted me with Ravenshade's accounts, and I let stress blind me. Clara, I'll help you manage this place if you'll have me." Clara nodded, her fingers tracing the scarf. Miss Marple saw echoes of a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper who'd mended ties through honest work. "Trust," she said, "is rebuilt one step at a time." Victor, his ruddy face calm, shrugged. "Ravenshade's not for me," he said. "I was chasing a dream that didn't fit. I'll find another way to settle my debts." His pragmatism struck Miss Marple as akin to a village merchant who'd learned to let go of a failing venture. "Wisdom, Mr. Henshaw," she said, "is knowing when to walk away." Clara, her voice stronger now, spoke last. "Beatrice wanted me to be strong," she said, clutching the scarf. I didn't know about the will, but I know she loved Ravenshade. Margaret and I will keep it alive for her." Her determination mirrored a St. Mary Mead girl who'd carried a family's legacy through grief. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "You'll do her proud, Miss Langley. Ravenshade is in good hands." The loose ends of the case were tied up quietly. The mysterious key found under the dining room rug was traced to a small box in Beatrice's study, containing letters from Gibbs that revealed his deepening obsession with preserving Ravenshade. One letter, written months ago, read, "This house is our heart, my lady. I'll protect it always." Miss Marple, reading it with Crane, sighed. "Love," she said, "can be a dangerous master, as I saw in St. Mary Mead with a man who clung too tightly to duty." The cyanide film, so cleverly placed in Beatrice's glass, was confirmed by Crane's team as a compound Gibbs could have prepared using cellar chemicals, likely sourced from silver cleaning supplies. The fireplace grate's flue with its hidden vial was a secret only a lifelong servant would know, its narrow passage a perfect hiding place. Clara's almond-scented perfume, mistaken for cyanide's odor, had been a cruel coincidence, exploited by Gibbs to muddy the waters. The scratched decanter, the planted vial, the forged contract, all were distractions, but Miss Marple's focus on the grate had cut through the noise. Crane shared that Gibbs, now awaiting trial in the village jail, had spoken little, his silence that of a man consumed by regret. "He said he thought he was saving Ravenshade," Crane told Miss Marple as they walked the estate's gardens. "Said it was his life's purpose." She nodded, her hat tilting in the breeze. "In St. Mary Mead we had a gardener who acted out of loyalty, not malice. Gibbs's heart broke when Beatrice chose to sell." The estate was stirring back to life. Clara and Margaret, now allies, planned to restore Ravenshade's gardens and open its doors to the village, turning it into a community hub. Charles, true to his word, had contacted a solicitor to liquidate his assets. Evelyn was packing for London, her scripts tucked under her arm, a new play in mind. Hartley was preparing to return to his university, his research notes secured. Victor had left that morning, his briefcase lighter without the forged contract. Miss Marple, her taxi waiting, took a final stroll through Ravenshade's overgrown gardens, the scent of damp earth mingling with autumn leaves. Clara joined her, the scarf wrapped around her shoulders. "You've given us a chance to heal," Clara said, her voice steady. "How do you see so much, Miss Marple?" The older woman smiled, her eyes distant. "In St. Mary Mead, my dear, I learned that people are the same everywhere, full of hopes, fears, and secrets. You only need to listen." As the taxi rolled down the drive, Ravenshade Hall receded into the mist, its windows glinting like eyes watching her departure. Crane waved from the steps, his notebook tucked away, a rare grin on his face. Miss Marple settled into the seat, her knitting bag at her side, her mind already turning to the quiet of St. Mary Mead. "Mysteries," she murmured, "are never far away." The moors stretched endlessly before her, and Ravenshade's echoes of love, betrayal, and redemption faded into the distance. Justice had been served not just in Gibbs's arrest, but in the second chances granted to those left behind. Miss Marple closed her eyes, content, knowing that every puzzle, no matter how dark, had its solution. Chapter 9. Shadows of Truth. A month had passed since Miss Jane Marple's taxi rolled away from Ravenshade Hall, leaving behind a house shaken by the revelation that Mr. Gibbs, the devoted butler, had poisoned Lady Beatrice Langley to preserve the estate he loved. The November air was sharper now. The moors around the Georgian manor cloaked in frost, the ivy-clad walls glistening under a weak sun. Ravenshade, with its creaking floors and faded grandeur, stood as a testament to resilience, its scars softened by the quiet efforts of those who remained. Miss Marple, back in the cozy familiarity of St. Mary Mead, had received a letter from Clara Langley, inviting her for a brief return to see the estate's transformation. Ever curious, she accepted, her knitting bag tucked under her arm as her taxi wound up the familiar drive. The hall's heavy oak doors opened to reveal Clara, her pale face brighter now, the scarf Miss Marple had gifted her, wrapped snugly around her shoulders. "Miss Marple," she exclaimed, her voice warm with gratitude, "you've come back." The young woman's eyes, once shadowed by fear, held a spark of purpose. Behind her stood Margaret Crane, the governess, her stern demeanor softened, her ledger replaced by a notebook of plans for the estate. "We're making changes," Margaret said, a rare smile breaking through. "Thanks to you." Miss Marple, her spectacles glinting, stepped into the parlor where the fire crackled as it had on that fateful first day. The room felt lighter, the portraits of stern Langleys less imposing under new gaslights Clara had installed. "Ravenshade is stirring," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but deliberate. "But houses, like people, carry their stories." She settled into a chair, her needles clicking softly, her sharp eyes taking in the changes and the faint unease that lingered. Clara and Margaret shared their progress. Inspired by Beatrice's love for the estate, they had begun restoring the gardens, hiring local hands to tame the overgrown hedges. "We're opening Ravenshade to the village," Clara said, her fingers tracing the scarf. "Tea rooms, a library, perhaps a schoolroom. Beatrice would have wanted it alive." Margaret nodded, her voice steady. "I've corrected the accounts. No more RC errors. We're starting fresh." Miss Marple smiled, recalling a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper who'd rebuilt trust through honest work. "A house," she said, "is only as strong as those who tend it." News of the other suspects reached her through Clara's letters and village gossip, which Miss Marple always found as reliable as any inspector's report. Charles Langley had kept his promise, selling his London flat and taking a clerk's position at a bank. "He writes weekly," Clara said, showing a letter in Charles's neat hand. "He's sober now, determined to honor Beatrice." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to a St. Mary Mead youth who'd turned from ruin to redemption. "A man's word," she said, "is his own justice." Evelyn Warwick had returned to London, her career revived with a new play that drew crowds. "She sent me a program," Clara said, producing a glossy booklet. "Says she's free of old shadows." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, remembering a village actress who'd risen above scandal. "The stage," she murmured, "is a fine place for new beginnings." Dr. Maurice Hartley had resumed his lectures at King's College, his research now locked in a university vault. "He wrote to apologize," Margaret said, "for any suspicion he caused. He's funding a scholarship in Beatrice's name." Miss Marple saw echoes of a St. Mary Mead doctor who'd learned to balance knowledge with care. "Wisdom," she said, "comes when we learn from our mistakes." Victor Henshaw had abandoned his bid for Ravenshade, redirecting his ambitions to a factory in Manchester. "He sent a note," Clara said, "wishing us well. Said Ravenshade taught him what's worth chasing." Miss Marple smiled faintly, thinking of a village merchant who'd let go of a failing dream. "Ambition," she said, "finds its path when guided by truth." Yet as tea was served, poured by a new maid, Lily, now promoted to housekeeper, a subtle unease crept into the room. Miss Marple's keen senses caught it. Clara's fingers hesitated over her cup, and Margaret's eyes darted to the window, where the moors stretched endlessly. "Something troubles you," Miss Marple said gently, her needles pausing. Clara flushed, glancing at Margaret, who nodded reluctantly. "It's the cellar," Clara said, her voice low. "We found something last week while clearing it for renovations." She produced a small tarnished box, its lock broken, containing a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. The handwriting was Beatrice's, addressed to James, the brother Clara had mentioned, the family disgrace. The letters spoke of a hidden heir, a child born out of wedlock, whose existence Beatrice had kept secret to protect Ravenshade's name. She wrote of revealing it, Clara said, before she died. Margaret added, "We thought it was over, but yesterday a man came to the village asking about James Langley. He wouldn't give his name, but he looked like the man in Clara's locket." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, recalling the photograph in Clara's locket, not of a fiancé, but of Uncle James. "A new puzzle," she murmured, "or perhaps an old one resurfacing." The letters hinted at a motive beyond Gibbs's confession. Had Beatrice's plan to reveal the heir pushed him to act, fearing the estate's legacy would be tainted? Or was this stranger now circling Ravenshade a new player in the story? Miss Marple turned the tarnished box over, noting a faint engraving. J.L., 1890. "In St. Mary, Mead," she said. "We once found a letter that reopened a case long closed. Be cautious, my dears." She advised Clara and Margaret to share the letters with Inspector Crane, who was still in the village wrapping up paperwork on Gibbs's case. "Truth," she said, "has a way of surfacing, but it needs a gentle hand." Clara nodded, her resolve firm. "We'll find out who he is," she said. "Ravenshade's seen enough secrets." As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she walked the gardens with Clara, the frost crunching underfoot. The estate was coming alive, villagers tending the hedges, children playing near the gate. "You've given Ravenshade a future," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. Clara smiled, her scarf catching the breeze. "And you gave us clarity," she replied. "Will you come back if we need you?" Miss Marple chuckled, adjusting her hat. "Mysteries, my dear, have a way of finding me." The taxi waited, its engine humming softly. Miss Marple glanced back at Ravenshade, its windows glinting like eyes holding secrets yet untold. The stranger in the village, the hidden heir, the tarnished box, these were threads of a new tapestry, one she'd leave to Clara and Crane for now. "In St. Mary, Mead," she murmured, "we learned that every ending is a beginning." As the taxi rolled away, the moors stretched into the distance, their silence a promise of stories yet to unfold. Miss Marple settled into her seat, her knitting bag at her side, her mind already turning to the quiet of her village and the mysteries that awaited. Chapter 10. The Final Thread. 6 months had passed since Miss Jane Marple's last visit to Ravenshade Hall, and the spring of 1928 brought a tentative warmth to the English countryside. The moors, once cloaked in frost, now bloomed with heather, and the grand Georgian estate, with its ivy-clad walls and polished windows, hummed with new life. Miss Marple, summoned by a letter from Clara Langley, arrived once more, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, her sharp eyes bright with curiosity. The letter had been urgent yet cryptic, hinting that the mysterious stranger and the tarnished box of letters found in the cellar had stirred a new puzzle, one Clara and Margaret Crane could not solve alone. The oak doors of Ravenshade opened to reveal Clara, her face no longer pale but flushed with purpose. The scarf Miss Marple had gifted her now a familiar accessory. "Miss Marple, thank you for coming," she said, her voice steady but edged with worry. "We've found answers, but they've raised more questions." Margaret Crane stood beside her, her sternness replaced by a quiet resolve, her notebook filled with plans for the estate's transformation into a community hub. "You were right about the letters," Margaret said. "They've changed everything." Miss Marple settled in the parlor where the fire crackled as it had on that fateful autumn day when Beatrice Langley died from a cyanide-laced glass of wine. The portraits of stern Langleys watched over a room now bright with fresh flowers and open curtains, a testament to Clara and Margaret's efforts. "Ravenshade is healing," Miss Marple said, her voice warm yet deliberate. "But old secrets have a way of lingering like shadows in St. Mary, Mead." Clara produced the tarnished box from the cellar, its broken lock revealing a bundle of letters in Beatrice's elegant hand, addressed to her brother James Langley, the family disgrace whose photograph Clara kept in her locket. The letters, read in full, confirmed James had fathered an illegitimate son, Thomas, born in 1895 to a village seamstress. Beatrice, to protect the Langley name, had banished James and supported Thomas secretly, sending funds through an intermediary, initialed R.C. in Margaret's ledger, now revealed as Robert Crane, Margaret's late uncle and Beatrice's trusted solicitor. Beatrice planned to acknowledge Thomas. Before she died, Clara said, her eyes wide, she wrote of bringing him to Ravenshade. The mysterious stranger who'd appeared in the village asking about James was Thomas himself, now a man of 33, a quiet schoolteacher from Devon. Clara had met him, guided by Inspector Crane, who'd returned to investigate the new lead. Thomas didn't know about Ravenshade until recently, Clara explained. He found a letter from Beatrice among his mother's things inviting him to claim his place. Margaret added, "He's no fortune hunter. He only wants to understand his past." Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, listened as Clara described Thomas's arrival. He was reserved, with James's stern features but a gentle demeanor, and had brought a diary of his mother's detailing Beatrice's secret payments. The diary confirmed Beatrice's change of heart. She'd intended to revise her will, not only to name Clara as heir but to include Thomas, a decision that had alarmed Mr. Gibbs, the butler, whose obsession with Ravenshade's legacy drove him to poison Beatrice. Gibbs knew, Miss Marple murmured, and his fear of change became his undoing, much like a gardener in St. Mary Mead who clung too tightly to tradition. Inspector Crane joined them, his mustache neatly trimmed, his notebook now filled with notes on Thomas's claim. "He's legitimate in character, if not in law," Crane said. "No criminal intent, just a man seeking his roots." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling. "In St. Mary Mead we had a boy who discovered his lineage late. The truth set him free, but it stirred the village." The question of Thomas's place at Ravenshade was delicate. Clara, now the estate's mistress, felt a kinship with him, both bound by Beatrice's love and loss. "I've offered him a share," she said, "not the estate itself, but a role in its future, perhaps as a teacher for the schoolroom we're building." Margaret nodded, her notebook open to a budget that included Thomas's involvement. "He's agreed to stay," she said. "It feels right." Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the other suspects whose lives had shifted since the case's resolution. Charles Langley, true to his word, was thriving as a bank clerk, his debts nearly cleared. "He visits often," Clara said, showing a letter in his neat hand. "He's found purpose," Miss Marple smiled, recalling a St. Mary Mead youth who'd rebuilt his life through honest work. "Redemption," she said, "is a quiet victory." Evelyn Warwick's new play was a London sensation, her past scandals forgotten. "She sent tickets," Clara said, producing a vibrant poster. "Says Ravenshade taught her resilience." Miss Marple saw echoes of a village actress who'd turned shame into strength. "The stage," she murmured, "loves a survivor." Dr. Maurice Hartley's lectures were now renowned, his research secured, and his scholarship in Beatrice's name flourishing. "He writes monthly," Margaret said, grateful for the lesson in humility. Miss Marple nodded, thinking of a St. Mary Mead doctor who'd learned to balance knowledge with care. "Wisdom," she said, "is the best legacy." Victor Henshaw's factory in Manchester was prospering, his ambitions realigned. "He sent a donation for the gardens," Clara said Ravenshade was a wake-up call. Miss Marple recalled a village merchant who'd found success by letting go. "Purpose," she said, "and finds those who listen." Gibbs's trial had concluded quietly, his guilty plea sparing a spectacle. He's in prison, Crane said, but he writes to Clara apologizing. Miss Marple sighed, her needles pausing. In St. Mary Mead, a man once acted out of love and paid dearly. Gibbs's heart was Ravenshade's, but it led him astray. The tarnished box's letters had clarified the RC payments in Margaret's ledger, resolving her guilt. The mysterious key, found under the dining room rug, was traced to Beatrice's private desk, where a final letter to Thomas expressed her regret for hiding him. She wanted to make things right, Clara said, her voice soft. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Regret, she said, is a heavy burden, but forgiveness lifts it. As evening fell, Miss Marple walked the restored gardens with Clara and Thomas, the heather blooming under their care. Thomas, shy but earnest, thanked her. You gave Clara peace, he said, and me a home. Miss Marple smiled, handing him a small knitted bookmark. In St. Mary Mead, she said, we learned that family is made, not born. The taxi waited, its engine a soft hum. Clara hugged Miss Marple, her scarf catching the breeze. You've changed us, she said. Margaret beside her nodded. Ravenshade's stronger because of you. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her eyes twinkling. Mysteries, my dears, are solved by seeing the heart. Keep yours open. As the taxi rolled away, Ravenshade Hall stood proud, its windows aglow with new life. The moors stretched into the twilight, their secrets settled, their future bright. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting bag at her side, her mind content. In St. Mary Mead, she murmured, every thread finds its place.